Imagine this for a moment. You're sitting in a quiet room, the kind of stillness that makes you feel both calm and a little uneasy at the same time. You've just turned down an opportunity, maybe a chance to lead a project at work, or perhaps a moment to share something deeply personal with someone you care about. You told yourself it wasn't the right time, that you weren't ready, that it was safer to stay where you are. But deep down, there's a whisper, a quiet voice that keeps asking, why do I always hold myself back? If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. I've spent over 3 decades studying the human mind, diving into the profound teachings of thinkers like Carl Jung, and I've seen this pattern in countless people, especially those of us in our middle and later years, living in places like the United States and Canada, where life often feels like a balancing act between comfort and regret. That whisper you hear, that hesitation, it's not just a random feeling, it's fear, and it's been shaping your life in ways you might not even realize. But here's the good news: fear isn't your enemy. It's a messenger, a guide, and today we're going to learn how to listen to it, how to understand it, and how to use it to heal your inner self and live the life you were always meant to live. In this video, we're going to walk through 5 powerful steps inspired by Carl Jung's wisdom and to help you overcome fear, face the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, and step into a life of true freedom and wholeness. Let's start with the first step: recognizing fear for what it really is. Carl Jung, one of the greatest minds in psychology, once said, "Where your fear is, there is your task." Let that sink in for a moment. Fear isn't here to stop you. It's here to show you where you need to grow, where you need to look deeper, where you need to reconnect with the parts of yourself you've been hiding from. For so many of us, especially as we get older, fear doesn't show up as a loud screaming monster. It's much quieter, much sneakier. It's the voice that says, "Not yet," when you think about speaking up in a group. It's the feeling that keeps you scrolling through your phone for hours instead of starting that project you've been dreaming about. It's the excuse you make to stay in a relationship or a job that no longer feels right because the idea of change feels too overwhelming. I've seen this in so many people over the years, and I've felt it myself too. A few years ago, I was offered a chance to speak at a large conference, something I'd always wanted to do. But the moment I said yes, a wave of fear washed over me. What if I mess up? What if they don't like what I have to say? What if I'm not good enough? I almost backed out, but then I remembered Jung's words. Where your fear is, there is your task. That fear wasn't telling me to run. It was telling me to step forward, to face the part of myself that felt unworthy, the part I'd been hiding for years. So I said yes, and I showed up, trembling but determined. And you know what? It was one of the most liberating experiences of my life. That's what fear can do when you listen to it the right way. It can lead you to growth, to healing, to a version of yourself you've been longing to become. So let's take a closer look at what fear really is. Most of us have been taught to see fear as something to avoid, something to push away, something to overcome by sheer willpower. But Jung saw it differently. He believed fear is a signal, a message from your deeper self, pointing to the places where you're disconnected, where you're not living in alignment with who you truly are. Think about it like this. Imagine your soul is trying to send you a letter that says it's time to grow, it's time to step into more of who you are. But instead of opening that letter, you ignore it. You turn up the noise in your life, you distract yourself with busy work, you tell yourself, "I'll deal with it later." That letter doesn't go away, it just gets louder, more insistent, and that's what fear feels like. It's not here to punish you, it's here to wake you up. Let me share a story to make this real for you. A few years ago, I worked with a woman named Susan, a 58-year-old teacher from Oregon. Susan had always dreamed of writing a book, a memoir about her life and the lessons she'd learned along the way. She had notebooks full of ideas, but every time she sat down to write, fear would creep in. What if no one reads it? What if they think it's silly? What if I'm not a good enough writer? So she kept putting it off, telling herself she'd start when she felt more ready, when the timing was better. But months turned into years, and that dream stayed buried. When we started working together, I asked her to think about what that fear was really saying. Was it trying to keep her safe, or was it trying to keep her small? That question opened up a floodgate of emotions for Susan. She realized her fear wasn't about writing a book at all. It was about being seen, about sharing her true self with the world, something she'd spent her whole life avoiding because she grew up in a family where being too much was frowned upon. That fear was protecting the little girl inside her who'd learned to stay quiet, to stay quiet, to stay small, but it was also keeping her from the life she was meant to live. So the first step to overcoming fear with Carl Jung's wisdom is to recognize it as a messenger, not a monster. When fear shows up, don't run from it. Don't push it away. Pause, take a deep breath, and ask yourself, what is this fear trying to show me? What part of myself have I been avoiding? Maybe it's your voice, the one you've silenced to keep the peace. Maybe it's your dreams, the ones you've buried because they felt too big, too risky. Maybe it's your pain, the wounds you've never let yourself fully feel. Whatever it is, fear is pointing you toward it, and that's where your journey begins. Now that we've started to see fear in a new light, let's move to the second step, understanding where that fear comes from, the hidden parts of yourself that Jung called the shadow. So we've started to see fear in a new light as a messenger pointing us toward the parts of ourselves we've been avoiding. But to truly understand what that fear is trying to tell us, we need to dig a little deeper to uncover where it's coming from. That brings us to our second step, understanding the hidden source of your fear, what Carl Jung called the shadow. Now, I know the word shadow might sound a bit mysterious, maybe even a little intimidating, but let me assure you, it's not something to be afraid of. The shadow isn't some dark, evil force inside you. It's simply the collection of everything you've pushed away, everything you've denied or rejected about yourself in order to fit in, to be accepted, to feel safe. It's the parts of you that you've been taught to hide, maybe because they were seen as too much, too weak, too messy, or too different. For example, maybe you grew up in a family where showing anger was considered wrong, so you learned to bury it deep down. Or perhaps you were told as a child that being too emotional was a sign of weakness, so you locked away your sensitivity to seem strong. Over the years, I've worked with so many people who've carried these hidden parts of themselves like a heavy weight, not even realizing how much it's been holding them back. The shadow is where your fear lives, because fear is the language of the shadow. It's the way those rejected parts of you try to get your attention, try to come back into the light. Carl Jung put it so beautifully when he said, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort." What he meant is that facing your shadow, facing your fear, isn't just about being brave. It's about being whole. It's about looking at the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject and saying, you belong here too. Let me share a story to bring this to life. A few years back, I met a man named Robert, a 62-year-old retiree from Toronto. Robert had spent his entire career as a manager in a corporate office, always the calm, composed one, the one who never rocked the boat. But after he retired, he started feeling this deep, unshakable anxiety, a fear that seemed to come out of nowhere. He couldn't understand why he felt so restless, so afraid of the future, when he finally had the time to enjoy his life. When we sat down together, I asked him to think about a time in his life when he felt he had to hide a part of himself. After a long pause, he told me about his childhood. Growing up, his father had been very strict, and any sign of anger or frustration was met with harsh punishment. So, Robert learned early on to suppress his anger, to always be the good boy, the one who never caused trouble. But that anger didn't disappear. It went underground into his shadow, and over the years, it turned into fear, fear of conflict, fear of standing up for himself, fear of even acknowledging what he really wanted. That fear was why he stayed in a job he didn't love for 30 years, why he never told his wife how he really felt about certain things, why he felt so lost in retirement. The moment Robert started to see his fear as a message from his shadow, everything changed. He realized that his anxiety wasn't about the future at all. It was about the past, about the anger he'd never let himself feel, the voice he'd never let himself use. So we started small. I encouraged him to write down all the things he'd been angry about over the years, not to act on them, but just to let them be seen, to let them be heard. And slowly over time, that fear began to loosen its grip. Robert started speaking up more, setting boundaries with his family, even taking up painting, something he'd always wanted to do but had been too afraid to try. That's the power of understanding your shadow. It's not about judging those hidden parts of yourself. It's about welcoming them back, giving them a seat at the table, so they no longer have to scream for your attention through fear. So, how do you start this process for yourself? It begins with a simple question. What have I been taught to hide? Maybe you were told that being ambitious was selfish, so you buried your dreams. Maybe you were taught that showing vulnerability was a sign of weakness, so you built walls around your heart. Maybe you were told that being different was dangerous, so you learned to blend in, to play small, to stay safe. Whatever it is, that's where your shadow lives, okay? And that's where your fear is born. Take a moment right now, if you can, and think about a fear that's been holding you back lately. Maybe it's the fear of starting something new, like a hobby or a project you've always wanted to try. Maybe it's the fear of speaking your truth, whether that's in a relationship or at a community event. Or maybe it's the fear of simply being seen, of letting the world know who you really are. Now ask yourself, what part of me am I afraid to show? What part of me did I learn to hide, maybe as a child, maybe in my younger years, to feel loved, to feel accepted? That's the beginning of uncovering your shadow, and it's the first step to understanding where your fear comes from. Once you start to see your fear as a message from your shadow, you'll notice something powerful. It's not random. It's not here to hurt you. It's here to help you become whole. And that brings us to our third step, recognizing how fear controls you, often in ways you don't even realize. Fear doesn't always show up as a racing heart or sweaty palms. Sometimes it's much more subtle, much more clever. It hides behind habits, behind thoughts, behind the things we tell ourselves are normal. Carl Jung warned us that fear often wears masks, and if we're not paying attention, we'll mistake it for something else entirely, like logic, or caution, or even wisdom. Over the years, I've seen fear take on so many disguises, especially in people like us, who've lived long enough to build up layers of protection around our hearts. Let me break down a few of the most common ways fear shows up, so you can start to spot it in your own life. First, fear often disguises itself as overthinking. Have you ever stayed up late at night, replaying a decision in your mind over and over again? Maybe you were thinking about whether to join a new book club, or whether to have a tough conversation with a friend, or whether to finally take that trip you've been dreaming about. Your mind starts spinning. What if I don't fit in? What if they get upset with me? What if something goes wrong? That's not just careful planning. That's fear whispering in your ear, trying to keep you stuck. Jung once said, "Thinking is difficult, that's why most people judge." What he meant is that we often overthink as a way to avoid taking action, because action feels risky, because action means facing the unknown. But here's the truth. Overthinking doesn't bring clarity, it brings delay. It's fear's way of keeping you in your comfort zone, even when that comfort zone isn't serving you anymore. I remember working with a woman named Margaret, a 65-year-old grandmother from Seattle. Margaret had always wanted to travel to Europe, something she dreamed about since she was a young girl. But every time she thought about booking the trip, her mind would start racing. What if I get lost? What if I can't handle the long flights? What if I'm too old to enjoy it? She'd spend hours researching, making lists, worrying about every possible thing that could go wrong, until she'd talk herself out of it completely. When we started working together, I asked her to notice what happened when she overthought. She realized that all that worrying wasn't helping her plan better. It was stopping her from planning at all. It was fear, dressed up as caution, keeping her from the adventure she'd always wanted. So we made a plan. Instead of trying to plan the perfect trip, she started small. She booked a short flight to a nearby city just to prove to herself that she could do it. And you know what? That small step gave her the confidence to finally book that trip to Europe. Last I heard, she was walking the streets of Paris, smiling from ear to ear, living a dream she'd almost let fear steal away. That's what happens when you see through fear's disguise. You stop letting it control you and you start taking back your life. Another common disguise for fear is perfectionism. How many times have you told yourself, I'll do it when I'm ready, or I'll start when I know exactly what to do? Maybe you've wanted to try painting or learn a new language or even start a small garden in your backyard, but you keep waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect plan, the perfect you. That's not ambition. That's fear, hiding behind the idea of perfection. Jung would say that perfectionism is just fear of being seen as not enough. It's your ego trying to protect you from criticism, from failure, from judgment. But here's the thing. Perfection is a myth. There's no such thing as the perfect moment, the perfect plan, or the perfect you. And every time you wait for it, you're giving fear the power to decide your life. I've seen this so often in my years of working with people. One of my clients, a 70-year-old man named George from Vancouver, had always wanted to learn how to play the piano. He'd bought a keyboard, set it up in his living room, but every time he thought about starting, he'd stop himself. I'll start when I have more time, he'd say, or I'll start when I find the perfect teacher. But months turned into years, and that keyboard just sat there, gathering dust. When we talked about it, George admitted that deep down, he was afraid of not being good enough. He was afraid of sounding terrible, of making mistakes, of looking foolish, even to himself. That fear of imperfection was keeping him from something that could have brought him so much joy. So I encouraged him to start small, to play just one note, then two, then a simple melody without worrying about how it sounded. And slowly over time, George started to play. He wasn't perfect, but he was happy, and that's what mattered. That's the power of letting go of perfectionism. You stop waiting for fear to give you permission, and you start living the life you were meant to live. Now, we've uncovered two of the ways fear hides, through overthinking and perfectionism, but there's more to explore. Let's keep going and look at how fear can control you through other disguises, like people-pleasing and so-called logic, so you can start to break free from its grip. We've already uncovered two of the ways fear hides in our lives, through overthinking and perfectionism. But fear has more disguises, and it's time to shine a light on them so you can break free. Let's continue with our third step, recognizing how fear controls you in ways you might not even notice. Another common mask that fear wears is people-pleasing. Have you ever found yourself saying yes to something you didn't want to do, just to avoid disappointing someone? Maybe you agreed to host a family gathering even though you were exhausted, or you stayed quiet during a conversation because you didn't want to upset anyone. I've seen this so often in my years of working with people, especially those of us in our middle and later years, when we've spent decades trying to keep the peace, to be the good one, the one everyone can count on. But here's the truth. Every time you say yes when you want to say no, every time you silence your own needs to make someone else happy, you're letting fear run the show. Fear tells you that if you're not liked, you won't be loved. If you're not nice, you'll be abandoned. And that fear often comes from a deep, wounded place in your shadow, a place where you learned, maybe as a child, that your worth was tied to how well you pleased others. Carl Jung warned us that when we betray our inner truth to gain outer approval, we create a false self, and nothing suffocates the soul more than living inauthentically. I remember a client of mine, Linda, a 67-year-old woman from Chicago. Linda was the kind of person everyone loved, always smiling, always helping, always putting others first. But inside, she was crumbling. She felt resentful, exhausted, and deeply unfulfilled, but she was terrified to admit it. When we started working together, she told me about her childhood. Growing up, her parents had gone through a messy divorce, and Linda quickly learned that the only way to keep things stable was to be the perfect daughter, the one who never caused trouble, the one who always made everyone happy. That pattern followed her into adulthood and even into her retirement years. She was so afraid of disappointing anyone that she'd lost touch with what she wanted, what she needed. Her fear of being unlovable had turned her into a people pleaser, and it was draining the life out of her. So we started small. I encouraged Linda to practice saying no, just once, to something small. She decided to tell her neighbor she couldn't babysit her grandkids that week, even though she felt guilty about it. And you know what? The world didn't fall apart. Her neighbor understood, and Linda felt a tiny spark of freedom, a little glimpse of what it might feel like to live for herself, not just for others. Over time, she started setting more boundaries, speaking her truth, and rediscovering the parts of herself she'd buried to keep everyone else happy. That's the power of seeing through fear's disguise of people-pleasing. You start to reclaim your voice, your needs, your life. Another way fear hides is by pretending to be logic, or what we often call being realistic. How many times have you told yourself, "That's not for people like me," or "I'm too old to try something new," or "Dreaming big is just naive"? Maybe you've wanted to take up dancing or start a small business or even move to a new city, but you stopped yourself because it didn't seem practical. That's fear dressed up as wisdom, convincing you to play small. Jung once said, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." If you never check in with your deeper truth, your desires, your values, you'll live in a world built by fear and call it safety. I've seen this in my own life too. A few years ago, I thought about writing a book, something I'd always wanted to do. But every time I sat down to start, a voice in my head would say, "Who do you think you are? You're not a writer. No one will read it. It's too late to start something like that." That voice sounded so logical, so reasonable, but it was just fear, trying to keep me in my comfort zone. It wasn't until I recognized it for what it was that I was able to push past it and start writing. And let me tell you, finishing that book was one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done. So, when you hear that voice telling you to be realistic, pause and ask yourself, is this really logic, or is this fear trying to keep me small? Because the life you're meant to live is often on the other side of that so-called realism. Now that we've seen how fear hides behind people-pleasing and logic, let's move to our fourth step, integrating your shadow to break free from fear's grip. Jung taught us that the only way to truly overcome fear is to face it consciously, not to fight it, not to ignore it, but to integrate it. That means bringing those hidden parts of yourself, the parts you've buried in your shadow, back into the light. It's not about becoming fearless overnight. It's about becoming self-aware, about understanding what your fear is protecting and learning to hold space for it. Jung put it so powerfully when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." What he meant is that true transformation happens when you face your shadow, when you look at the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject and say, "I see you and you're part of me." So how do you do this in real life? Let's break it down into a few practical steps. First, name your fear. Take a piece of paper and write down exactly what you're afraid of, but be specific. Don't just write, "I'm afraid of failure." Dig deeper. Maybe you're afraid of looking foolish if you try something new, like joining a dance class. Maybe you're afraid of being rejected if you tell someone how you really feel. Maybe you're afraid of not being enough if you go after a dream, like starting a new hobby or volunteering in your community. When you name your fear clearly, you take it out of the shadows and into the light, and that's the first step to disarming it. Next, identify where that fear came from. Ask yourself, when did I learn this fear? What moment, what person, what experience planted this seed? Maybe your fear of looking foolish comes from a time in school when a teacher laughed at you for giving the wrong answer. Maybe your fear of rejection comes from a relationship where you were hurt for being vulnerable. These moments live in your subconscious, and until you meet them again consciously, they'll keep running the show. I worked with a man named Paul, a 60-year-old from Florida who had a deep fear of conflict. He'd avoid any kind of disagreement, whether it was with his wife, his kids, or his friends. When we dug into it, he remembered a moment from his childhood. His parents used to argue loudly, and every time they did, Paul felt like the world was falling apart. So he learned to avoid conflict at all costs, to keep the peace, to stay safe. But that fear was keeping him from having honest, meaningful relationships. Once he saw where it came from, he was able to start working through it, to start having those tough conversations, even when they scared him. The third part of integrating your shadow is to reclaim what you've rejected. Ask yourself, what part of myself did I abandon to survive? Maybe it was your assertiveness, your creativity, your joy, your anger, your vulnerability. Whatever it is, start practicing showing up as that part of yourself, even if it feels uncomfortable at first. If you've buried your assertiveness, practice saying no to something small, like declining an invitation you don't want to accept. If you've buried your creativity, pick up a paintbrush or write a poem, or try something new, even if it's messy. Every time you do this, you're telling your shadow, "I see you and you're welcome here." And every time you do, your fear loses a little more of its power. That brings us to our fifth and final step, embracing individuation, the process of becoming your true self. Carl Jung believed that the ultimate goal of life isn't perfection, but wholeness, what he called individuation. It's about becoming fully and consciously yourself, not who the world expects you to be, not who your family wanted you to be, not who fear has shaped you to be, but who you were always meant to be. This isn't just a feel-good idea. It's a deep psychological transformation, because the more you deny parts of yourself, the more fear grows. But the moment you start integrating your shadow, something incredible happens. You stop being at war with yourself. And when you're no longer fighting your inner world, the outer world loses its power to scare you. Let me share one last story to bring this home. A few years ago, I worked with a woman named Ellen, a 72-year-old from New York. Ellen had spent most of her life as a homemaker, always putting her family first, always playing the role of the perfect wife and mother. But after her kids moved out and her husband passed away, she felt lost, like she didn't know who she was anymore. She was afraid of starting over, afraid of being alone, afraid of figuring out what she wanted for the first time in decades. When we started working together, we went through the steps we've talked about. She named her fears, identified where they came from, and started reclaiming the parts of herself she'd buried, like her love for music and her desire to connect with new people. Over time, Ellen started taking small steps toward individuation. She joined a local choir, something she'd always wanted to do but had been too afraid to try. She started making new friends, speaking her mind, and even traveling on her own. The last time we spoke, she told me, "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living for me, not for anyone else. That's what individuation looks like. It's not about never feeling fear again. It's about not letting fear decide your life. It's about stepping into the fullness of who you are with all your light and all your darkness and finding freedom in that wholeness. So let's bring this all together. We've walked through 5 powerful steps to overcome fear with Carl Jung's wisdom. First, we recognized fear as a messenger, not a monster, pointing us toward the parts of ourselves we've been avoiding. Then we uncovered the hidden source of that fear, the shadow, the parts of ourselves we've rejected. We learned to spot the ways fear controls us through overthinking, perfectionism, people-pleasing, and so-called logic. We took the brave step of integrating our shadow, bringing those hidden parts back into the light. And finally, we embraced individuation, the journey of becoming our true selves, whole and free. I know this journey isn't always easy, especially for those of us who've spent years, maybe decades, living with fear as a constant companion. But I promise you, every small step you take, every moment you choose to face your fear instead of running from it, brings you closer to the life you were always meant to live. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to be true. True to yourself, true to your heart, true to the person you were before the world told you to be afraid. I'd love to hear from you now. What's one fear you're ready to face after watching this video? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, your experiences, your dreams. I read every single one, and your words might just inspire someone else to take that first step. If this video spoke to you, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to Ageless Philosophies for more wisdom to help you live your best life at any age. Here's to facing your fears, healing your inner self, and stepping into the fullness of who you are. You've got this, and I'm cheering you on every step of the way.